Starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining. We're going to wait a couple more minutes for people to join, and then we'll get started. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining. My name is Anushka Pandey. I'm on the marketing program teams at Nielsen. I'm excited to be joined by our speakers today, Sucharita Kodali, who is a vice president, principal analyst with Forrester, serving digital business strategy professionals. She is an expert on e-commerce, omni-channel retail, consumer behavior, and trends in the online shopping space. She's also an authority on technology developments that affect the online commerce industry and vendors that facilitate online marketing and merchandising. She is joined by Kristin Vento, a senior vice president in business development at Nielsen. She works with clients to identify business issues and create actionable solutions that will yield maximum value. Kristin has an extensive history in working with big data to provide actionable insights for CPG, SRR, retail, pharma, and other verticals. On behalf of Sucharita, Kristin, and me, it's our pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar. I have a little housekeeping before we begin. You've all been placed on mute for this webinar. If you have any questions, please navigate to the questions section of the GoToWebinar control panel on the right of your screen and type into the text field. We'll take your questions during the Q&A session at the end, but feel free to submit any at any time. Also, we'll be recording the webinar and making it available to everyone who is registered, so be on the lookout for an email post-webinar containing the on-demand video. Today's webinar, 5 Ways CPG Brands Can Thrive in an Age of Disruption, will cover the top challenges for CPG brands in a rapidly changing retail and consumer environment, the implications these challenges have on marketers, and recommendations on how to adapt going forward. Without further ado, Sucharita, you may begin.
Thanks, Anushka. We can go to the next slide. So there are 3 major trends that have influenced the CPG landscape, and I'm going to walk you through each of them. The first is the changing nature of product distribution. So let's go ahead and get straight into that. Next slide. And when I mean product distribution, it really is how consumers are getting a hold of various products. And this includes, of course, packaged goods. One of the single biggest changes in retail has been the growth of online marketplaces. Online marketplaces are e-commerce sites where third-party sellers have the ability to put their products on a platform and consumers purchase directly from those sellers, often bypassing retailers and other authorized distributors of various goods. Now, it gets much more complicated than that, and I'm oversimplifying because some sellers can in fact be retailers, sometimes sellers are distributors themselves, but for the most part, it is an ecosystem of essentially mom and pop sellers. That number has been growing and will continue to grow. So when we look at global marketplaces, these online marketplaces, by 2020, we expect that figure to be nearly 2/3 of online retail. And even in the United States, online marketplaces are almost half of retail and will continue to grow through 2020. Next slide. The part that often is overlooked is how online marketplaces have grown. And a prevailing narrative is that we should lean into marketplaces, particularly in sectors like grocery or packaged goods, because they are growing. But in fact, I would argue, and I'll walk you through some of the challenges that brands have had with their supply chains that have in fact led to the very growth of the marketplaces itself. So it ends up being a little bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you take just an example brand, this is an anonymous brand that is an aggregate composite, essentially, of different types of brands in different sectors, and essentially these brands distribute in mainly three different ways. They either have direct retail relationships with their large retail channels. They go through distributors that help to supply smaller retailers, or sometimes they supply to online sellers. And a small percent of retail by most brands, particularly in packaged goods, is direct to consumer, and even 5% can be aggressive in some grocery categories where many of those brands actually choose to not sell direct to consumer at all. But what ends up happening is that because of that middle section of distributors, who often then ultimately will sometimes directly go to online channels such as marketplaces, or they will go and they'll sell to the small sellers who sell as sellers on marketplaces. You end up with scenarios where where items end up showing up on these marketplaces, and consumers in your traditional retail channels use those online prices for everything from price matching to showrooming to ultimately even doing some activities like returning some of those online items to physical stores. So that creates a problem for both brands and for retailers. But that's not the only issue. Next slide. That essentially ends up creating what we call a gray market for goods, where you had initially authorized distributors who were supposedly selling items to sellers with physical retail destinations where consumers could purchase, but that ends up just essentially creating the distribution of goods through unauthorized channels. And because e-commerce, particularly in the online grocery world, is still relatively small, it's taken some time for brands to even recognize that this is an issue, although interestingly, as a result of the COVID crisis, it's becoming more and more clearly to light. And that brings me to the next slide, which is the second and third big problems of brand mismanagement leading to some of these distribution issues. The second is related to essentially undisciplined promotions. And retailers, as you know, have temporary price reductions. They have their shopper marketing dollars, which are constantly promoting items in their stores. And what ends up happening with a number of these gray market sellers is that they literally will go to stores, physical stores, purchase up as much as they can, and then put that merchandise back into the retail marketplace as an online retail seller. In many cases, those prices will be lower But in the cases of the COVID crisis, where there were certain products like hand sanitizer that were in low supply, you would see stories of price gouging in the other direction. And you continue to see price gouging online for key products that are often sold out in stores. The third issue is related to the fact that a lot of brands have just simply not leaned into direct-to-consumer. And I'll share with you exactly the problem in a subsequent slide. But I just want to share with you, next slide, the flywheel of essentially that example where sellers are purchasing from physical stores, and then that merchandise simply shows up on a third-party marketplace. And this is what I call the retail arbitrage flywheel, where you have products just simply purchased in bulk. In some cases, those sellers will actually store the merchandise in their own storage units. Sometimes they will send them straight to businesses called prep centers, where there are businesses that will essentially repackage merchandise specifically with the intent to sell on online marketplaces. And the great irony of all of this is that retailers, in many cases, will continue to reward these sellers because retail loyalty programs are often based on volumes of transactions. So you are seeing people who are purchasing a lot with you thinking that they're your end consumers, but in fact, they are just simply middlemen who are then taking that merchandise to sell it again subsequently in another life on these e-commerce channels. On the next slide, I just want to share with you an example of some of the direct-to-consumer challenges that brands will have. And this is an example of a cell phone case where the brand itself is selling the product for twice the price that a marketplace is selling the same item. And when brands have this type of price discrepancy, consumers, for the most part, are not going to ever choose to purchase with brands. But when you look at other categories, like, for instance, the travel industry, and you look at the hospitality industry, those companies will have best price guarantees for their owned e-commerce sites. And when that happens, that is the reason that in travel and hospitality, you do see up to 30% of their total volume going directly through their DTC sites versus going through a third-party travel aggregator. So that's another important piece to keep in mind, is that when prices are simply not that compelling, nobody is going to buy. That's as simple as the demand curve. Now, the great irony is that even with these poor pricing differences and with brands having higher prices and extremely uncompelling experiences on their owned websites, these brands, in many cases, are still seeing 5% of their sales online. And that really points to the fact that consumers trust the brand, and they would actually like to trust the brand more if the brand had compelling pricing on their website as well. So next slide. Hopefully it's not stuck. The other set of issues that are important to keep in mind is that marketplaces have a slew of other issues associated with them. There are questionable ratings and reviews on these sites. There is often counterfeit merchandise, poorly constructed products, patent violations, and also there's unfair data where they are often collecting information from sellers with the intent to sometimes use that against against manufacturers by getting into private label itself. So I have just some screenshots on the next few slides. So the next slide is just an illustration of the fact that reviews and ratings in particular that come from those reviews don't always even have a mathematical average that is calculating that number. And that leads to questions on the next slide about, well, what is really the rating of a number? We can go ahead and go to the next slide as well. And there are companies like Review Meta, for instance, that essentially normalize the scores on different marketplace sites to basically take out some of the reviewers who may not necessarily be authentic reviewers, purchasers of products, or have a pattern of seemingly being evidence of a bot of some sort. Next slide. We also know, and this goes back to some of the reasons that consumers, even when the prices are higher, still nonetheless choose to purchase on a brand's direct-to-consumer site. And it has a lot to do with concerns around counterfeit merchandise, concerns that product that may be sold through a marketplace seller is old or aged inventory, or that in some way, shape, or form it may not be as high quality as what you would find in a store that has fresher sell-by dates. Next slide. And the last bit that is incredibly important to keep in mind is that when there are rogue products, either unauthorized sellers, kind of not storing products in optimal condition, or companies that may just be using your trademarks, what ends up happening is that if there is a consumer liability case, the brand is still liable. And the onus is on the brand to prove that either the product is not theirs or that there were some extremely poor processes that were not followed in the case of the distribution of that product. So this is something that I think brands have often overlooked, is the liability that sometimes is associated with these third-party sellers selling their goods. So next slide. The second major trend that we're seeing is the shift in the marketing mix, and this is something that I just think is so important to recognize. On the next slide, what I mean by that shift in marketing mix is of course that more marketers in CPG, as well as in every sector of retail, are spending more digitally. They're spending more in search, they're spending more in social, they're even spending more on advertising on marketplaces like Amazon and others. And what you see in green are those numbers for the speculated spend in marketing by different retailers in 2020. This is a survey that Forrester conducted in partnership with the National Retail Federation. So on the next slide, from the same survey, we also see that the beneficiaries of the marketing spend is highly concentrated in a small number of media properties. So on the left, you have those places where, of the respondents in the surveys, the ones that said that one of those companies was one of their top 3 marketing destinations, and the light green has the companies that said that that company was the top marketing destination. And then on the right-hand side, you have the level of concentration. And what we see here is that a huge percent of the overall respondents in this survey say that they are spending more than 75% of their entire digital marketing budget just on those 3 companies. Now, on the next slide, what we see is something that's very, very different, which is that some of those digital marketing tactics, and in fact, all of the ones on the previous pages that I suggested to you, are often tuned out by customers. Yet that is where, as an industry, we are leaning into marketing. So what we have here are 2 sets of data points. On the top, these are different media tactics, and what are consumers, this is self-stated by consumers, what do they want to listen to? What are they more likely to listen to? And on the bottom, what are they most likely to avoid? Interestingly, all of those digital touch points are on the right side of the slide. That means that consumers are more likely to tune digital touch points out and less likely to tune them in. Meanwhile, some of the traditional advertising that we have been leaning away from as an industry is what is actually more effective. And that fundamentally is the challenge here, which is on the next slide, which begs the question of have we really been allocating media as effectively as we can? And I would argue that maybe we haven't, because when you look back from between 1990 and 2010, I'd call that the big box era. Those were the years that companies like Walmart and Costco dominated retail and were really, really growing. And when you look at the growth of those large retailers, it was triple digits. But what's also important to keep in mind is that brands were also growing double digits in that same period in time. I always remember one of the large CPG companies telling me that they just rode the Walmart rocket through the 90s. And I love that expression because there was a rocket to ride. However, when we look at the last decade, you look at how much the large retailers have declined from their growth rate and how much the large technology titans, and I include all of those companies that we're leaning into from a digital advertising standpoint as a technology titan. Those guys have started to now grow triple digits. Meanwhile, brands have actually seen their revenue decline. On the other hand, there are certain holdout brands. These are companies that have chosen to really lean into direct-to-consumer instead, and they really aren't as eager to embrace the tech titans, and they've seen their numbers go up too. So what begs the question for me is, these companies, these large tech titans want you to be spending more of your money with them. Of course they do, because look at their growth rate. But it hasn't necessarily resulted in very much success for you. And I'm not saying that this is necessarily causal. It's highly, highly coincidental. But it does beg the question, especially looking on the previous page, of what is improving from a sales standpoint and what is effective from a marketing standpoint. Maybe brands really need to rethink their allocation strategy, and this is where more sophisticated marketing tactics become essential. So next slide. The last bit that is the trend that is incredibly important to keep in mind are differences in demographics and consumer attitudes. We know that these are changing. Just some ways that we're seeing it change on the next slide. There is greater inequality than ever before in the United States. I used the Gini coefficient. If you're not familiar with that, it's an economic variable basically that measures inequality. If you are a zero or close to a zero in your Gini coefficient as a country, that means that you have a pretty equal society. Like 10% of people have 10% of wealth. And what happens is that if you're closer to a 1, that means that you're becoming more of an unequal society. And look at this. This is over the last several decades, the United States is becoming a much more unequal society. In there are about 200 countries in the world. The United States is not even amongst the top 100 from a Gini coefficient standpoint. It is closer to 1 than nearly half the countries in the world. So next slide. We also know that grocery, particularly packaged goods, has faced a significant amount of deflation over the years. Consumers have certainly been able to eat more, have been able to eat better, but the amount of money that consumers are spending on grocery has declined historically. Now, we are certainly seeing a spike that is very, very unique in the last week or two that we'll talk about, but for the most part, this has been a big, big challenge for packaged goods brands. It's essentially the shift away from eating at home to eating out, and that of course is reversing just in the past week. But for the most part, this is a historic trend. Next slide. We know that consumers are also concerned about environmentalism and sustainability, environmentally friendly products and packaging. And in many cases, they even pay more for those environmentally friendly packages. And these are things that have impacts on their everyday usage products like packaged goods. And that is that's something that I know every major brand has at the back of its mind. And my last bit on the next slide is related to just the fact that consumers are extremely brand disloyal now more than ever, in large part because there's so much supply of different types of products that they have access to online and even in physical stores. Young people in particular are always willing to try and do new things. And what that means is there's just epic levels of brand disloyalty that make it seem like your customer acquisition costs are very, very low early on in a brand's life cycle, but then they become extremely challenged because it's very difficult to retain those customers over time. Next slide. So what I think all of this means for brands is three things. One is that just the nature of distribution means that brands should embrace a concept called eControl, and I'm going to talk about that on my next slide. Brands need to embrace analytics to understand true marketing effectiveness, and I know that Kristin's going to talk about this in her section of the presentation. And then finally, brands really, really need to be nimble, embrace values that matter to customers at the moment in time that matters to them. And also there needs to be authoritative data on even topics like sustainability, and I'll share with you what I mean by that. So on the next slide, just high level, what does eControl really mean? Three things. One is you have an authorized reseller program, and anybody who's not on that reseller program gets kicked out of your distribution network. The second is you must have better governance around your supply chain to track your products. And third, you need to have the intestinal fortitude to litigate violators. And there are law firms out there that are pioneering the concept of eControl, companies like Voorhees out of Columbus, Ohio. And those are the brands that are incredibly important. And this is incredibly important for brands. My last slide here on sustainability is related to just the fact that we don't even know if plastic bags are bad for the environment or not. And I'll tell you why, because there's a company, a grocer called Harris Teeter, which is a part of Kroger. They collect plastic bags, and it turns out that those plastic grocery bags actually all get recycled into high-end outdoor decking products. So it's somewhat difficult to say that, oh, a certain type of bag is better or worse than another when we don't even really have the facts around what is the afterlife of some of these things that we have perceptions that they may not be as helpful or as environmentally friendly as otherwise perceived. Now I have a couple of slides here on just the latest COVID data, consumer COVID data. I unfortunately do not have great great news for you guys about this. The sentiment has really, really changed overnight in the last week when we saw social distancing really starting on March 17th. My data that I gathered in partnership with BizRate Insights, which is a online shopper panel. It is weighted a little bit more toward women, but it's nonetheless a national sample that is otherwise kind of representative of the general population. Nearly 3/4 of people think that the economy in the next 12 months is going to get worse. And that contrasts with a survey that McKinsey actually did just a few days prior, where there was a little bit more optimism. The questions were asked in a slightly different way, so that too could account for some of the differences, but we know that in the last week, sentiment has really, really fallen off a cliff. Next slide. And I unfortunately don't have great news to report either about growth or decline from the standpoint of different types of retailers either. I captured some of this data back in 2008 during the last major recession, and what we saw was that the mass merchants and the warehouse clubs would do well. And I generally like to take the number in the gray and then subtract the number in the dark blue from it. And if the number in the gray is higher, that means that net, that type of merchant should fare okay. So the only numbers here in 2020 that we see faring well are, again, those similar types of merchants, as well as, in this case, online retailers of grocery and general goods. Now, the one point to keep in mind is that these are consumers. This is not to say that 35% of all consumers are going to spend more on online grocery. This is only 35% of online grocery buyers are going to say that they spend more, which actually means that 10%, even of online grocery buyers, are not going to be spending more. And that is important because that reconciles with the previous slide where a lot of people are really worried about the economy. So next slide. Is the other piece about online that's a challenge at this moment in time is that customer experiences aren't great. A lot of consumers are finding out of stocks, shipping times being higher than expected. And in fact, the truth is that a lot of people just want to get back to normal as soon as possible. And that's creating a lot of anxiety as well. I think that brings me to the end of my slides. Oh, we did have, kind of short, long, and long term. I'll leave this to you when you guys have your own ability to take some time and digest some of the content here. So I'll skip over this. And just summarize that product distribution is changing, marketing is changing, and demographics and consumer attitudes are changing. And with that, I will hand the virtual presentation over to Kristin.
Great. Thank you so much, Sucharita. I think it was really helpful to hear Forrester's really insightful perspective on the trends and recommendations in this super dynamic space. I think a lot of things that we're going to talk about are really in line with a lot of the data that you just showed, which is really great. I'm going to now focus on CPG brands and how we can succeed among this disruption and uncertainty in the marketplace. And specifically highlight a few of the strategies that we feel are most important to drive success in the midst of all of these disruptions. Oops. Okay, great. So disruption. We're talking a lot about disruption in the marketplace. So obviously COVID-19 is a major disruption that's going on in the world. I think that everyone can feel the disruption right now. We can see it everywhere in our lives. The way we're living, the way we're working, shopping, we're all homeschooling our kids, we're working from home. So all of these things that we are doing are very different because of COVID-19. It's a constant reminder of the disruption. So what does this disruption mean to us from a media and a measurement perspective? So our Chief Commercial Officer, Peter Bradbury, just shared in a recent interview, due to the corona pandemic, data is showing an increase in media consumption across all platforms, which is consistent with what we've seen from other major events we've experienced in the past, snowpocalypse and other phenomenon. In some areas that have been quarantined, there's been a significant spike in such as Seattle, of media content, about 23% across all demographics. For younger demographics, it's been doubled in gaming devices. Staying in our homes can lead to almost a 60% increase in the amount of content we consume. As you can see on this slide, media consumption of consumers before COVID-19 was already at an all-time high. Consumers were spending about 12 hours a day on media content across all different types of media. The bulk of the time was on live TV and internet via their computers. We're also seeing when people stay home, their media consumption increases significantly. Nielsen's tracking these media trends on a daily basis. We're providing updates to our clients to help them maneuver through this crisis. We also have a quarterly total audience report that tracks consumer media habits in great depth so that we can work with you to better understand how to pivot strategies and accommodate for these changing media dynamics. So obviously COVID is currently a major disruption in our industry. That's what we have going on right now, but we've also had many other disruptions that we've been dealing with for quite some time. Sucharita touched on several of them. There's 9 primary disruptions that I was going to speak about today that are significantly impacting the CPG industry. The first is e-commerce. This is obviously a big one. It's significantly impacting us. It's also going to be significantly impacted with COVID-19. This channel represents 11% of buying pre-COVID and has been growing by about 35%. This will obviously be impacted significantly with this crisis, and after will also change many consumers' buying habits. The second is the rise of the digital consumer. We have lost control of the consumer conversation with things like Instagram and Facebook. Social media and influencers have taken over. It's very difficult for CPG companies to own the conversation with our consumers. The aging consumer base Adults over 65 will outnumber children under 18 for the first time in 2024. So how does that change how we communicate with the consumers of our products? Shifting demographics. Growth of minorities by 2045 in this country will become the majority minority. So this is very different than what we've looked like in the past. So again, how does this change how we speak to our consumers? Also, what types of products do we carry in our stores, and also in what stores and online? More private label competition. Private label has become much more competitive. They've also provided much more upscale options. So what does this do to impact our branded options? Also, how does this affect assortment within our retail outlets? Shrinking shelf space has also become another big issue for us. Stores have become smaller in many cases and a lot more varieties. So how does this impact us from a CPG perspective to remain competitive? Sustainability, Sucharita touched on that. This is obviously becoming much more important to consumers. So how do we take that into consideration when we're providing offerings as well as pricing? Disloyal consumers. This is also something that was just talked about. Consumers are no longer loyal. So only about 8% of consumers are loyal. As we just talked about, many consumers are trying new things, new brands. So it is very difficult to speak to loyal consumers. And the last one is direct to consumer. This is something with Dollar Shave Club, others, they are really making an impact in the marketplace. And obviously with COVID, this will become even a bigger issue. So while disruptions can be challenging, they can also create opportunities. Some of the greatest ideas have been generated in times of great disruption and challenge. CPG companies can't turn their backs on these disruptions or trends, but they can harness the power of the data to overcome challenges and lay the foundation for more flexible, responsible, and efficient marketing strategies. We recommend to clients to leverage the right data and insights so they can empower their CPG organizations to flourish today and into the future. I'm going to now talk about 5 strategies that can be leveraged to do that. The first strategy that we would recommend is testing new campaigns and tactics. This will help you ensure marketing resources are used efficiently and effectively. We can eliminate guesswork and allow marketers to quantify what's working and what's not, and also figure out why. A well-built testing approach can help marketers to become more agile and identify new opportunities for reaching consumers or prospects and determine what's resonating with consumers. It can also help answer key questions like, did my campaign have a positive impact in store, also online? And we can also look at which segments had the strongest response. This will also allow marketers to optimize future media buys and get better information as they move forward on future campaigns. The second recommendation we have is to measure and optimize marketing. Most marketers do not have unlimited budgets, especially in this time. So they must be able to measure performance and ensure that the money that they spend is going to directly increase sales. Measuring performance can provide powerful insights to consumer segments and also campaign elements, and better understand which ones are driving the greatest response. This way, marketers can make better, smarter decisions going forward. We can provide more advanced measurement approaches that can provide those insights from a plan and optimize perspective so that they can work, again, more efficiently and effectively. We can also provide a predictable ROI for marketers so that they can estimate future return in advance of implementations that might happen in the future. The third recommendation that we have for marketers is to prove marketing effectiveness within the company. One of the key metrics for any marketing department is the ability to help the company drive revenue. Marketing departments must be able to prove that the strategies and tactics motivated their buyers to take some action, whether it was just visiting the website or downloading a coupon or purchasing the product, which is always where we want to get them to go. But it's also important to understand what actions they're taking on their path to purchase. So by establishing a connection between the advertising initiatives as well as the sales, marketers can determine the value as well as their ROI. Marketers will get the proof that they need for leadership so that they could get additional resources down the road. The fourth recommendation that we have is to demonstrate marketing effectiveness to retailers. This is very important as well. While it's critical for marketing departments to be able to prove the value to their company, it's also critical for companies to prove the value of their marketing as support to retailers. Sucharita just showed a lot of information about what was happening in the retail environment. So being able to be competitive for retailers is even more important now with everything going on in the marketplace. Increase in the sheer number of products, plus the rise in superstores, means a smaller number of retailers essentially acting as gatekeepers for millions of consumers. In order to capture and keep the attention of the retailers in this competitive environment, companies will need to show retailers they're investing in their brands and driving sales for those retailers. Measurement techniques that calculate how much a marketing campaign has boosted the sales provides a fast and cost-effective way to get this proof. The last recommendation that we have is to improve efficiency to avoid wasted spend. Testing and optimization can help organizations fine-tune their messaging and maximize ROI of their investment and calculate optimal levels of media spend for various campaigns and different tactics. At some point, marketing reaches a point of diminishing returns, depending on the product or the audiences you're targeting, different media, or other factors. Rather than overspending, especially in a market like we're in now, we can help clients pinpoint the exact level where you can optimize impact. We find that companies do measurement. On average, they experience a 10 to 20% increase in their marketing ROI. Nielsen can help CPG companies in these changing times with campaign lift. Nielsen Campaign Lift is an effective approach to meeting many of the challenges facing CPG brands. It can help demonstrate the value of marketing activities and help optimize campaigns by understanding specific buyer segments and elements. Nielsen's Lift can help clients understand if their campaigns had an impact on sales and share, also if it had a positive return on ad spend, and if we would recommend to run the campaign more broadly or not. Nielsen's Lift solution compares sales metrics for those who saw the campaign versus those who did not, and calculate the incremental sales lift generated by that marketing campaign. Sales impact is measured and interpreted by analyzing changes in purchase behavior among buyers or geographies exposed to the campaign compared to those not exposed. Nielsen has unmatched access to sales data across all industries and all tactics. By leveraging these solutions, CPG organizations can take control and thrive in this age of disruption. Hopefully you will decide to turn disruption into an opportunity, and we would be happy to help you do that. So if you'd like to go deeper on this topic in terms of understanding the different ways that the marketplace is being disrupted, we'd be happy to have you download the ebook that goes into more detail on these 5 ways, as well as the disruptors. This can be downloaded here, or feel free to email our marketing solutions website and we can provide more information. We'll also be sending out some information as a follow-up from the webinar. I think now we're going to open it up for questions. All right. Oops. I'm going to go to the questions. Okay, I'm going to start with the first question, which is, what do you think the biggest opportunity is for CPG right now? Oh, sorry.
Oh, no, go ahead. Did you want me to respond, Kristin?
Sure, go ahead. I'll look through some of the other questions while you respond, and then I can respond after you.
Yeah, so I think that the biggest issues that CPGs need to respond to right now is getting direct to consumer working, and I know that a lot of CPGs haven't had great success in the past, but what is different now is that the COVID virus is different now, and there are a number of partners that can help get you online and with great distribution and great customer fulfillment and customer service very, very quickly. So I think that that's a huge opportunity there, that gives you the chance to own your own customer, to, kind of tell your story and sell authentic goods. And then the other big opportunity is to really, really get into the business of supply chain governance, because right now the lack of discipline around how products are distributed is driving the growth in marketplaces, which is not to the benefit of consumers, brands, or retailers.
Yeah, I think the only thing I would add to that, because I'm just looking through the additional questions right now in terms of media habits and things like that. I think I would just say, obviously we highlighted a few different brands, Sucharita did in her presentation, that are being significantly impacted by COVID. I think, understanding your brand and the role that it has to play right now and how it's being impacted, understanding consumers' media habits, understanding the media that you're running in and what makes sense. That's how we're working with clients right now. Understanding where the opportunities are, as I talked about, for you to potentially engage and change media to better meet consumers. I think it is an opportunity since consumers are, digesting more media right now. I think that is an opportunity from a targeting and a reaching them perspective. And then from a measurement perspective, we're getting some questions there. I think, as I said, just understanding, how you're currently putting media out there right now, and then just working with, Nielsen, and just kind of better understanding what the best tool is to measure and time periods, right? Because we want to make sure that we're measuring it in the best way possible. That's how we're working with people right now. And, I showed one slide on media habits, but we have a lot of additional detail that's breaking down media habits in this environment. And obviously it's changing, during the different phases of COVID, right? We had the initial stage, we have a stage now, and we will get into different stages. We also have different types of consumers based on different demographics and how they're treating COVID. And, we have the people who initially were out purchasing, hoarding, and then we have, different types of people and how they're reacting. So there's a lot of information out there, and that's why the point of what I was saying is leverage the data and kind of know what you're doing based on telling you. So I think just informing yourself and making good decisions there is what we want to do, is the message. I think the message is don't stay idle and not do anything. I think that's the wrong thing to do. Okay, so we have another question about, let's see here. Will the Forrester slide? Okay, yes, Forrester slides will be shared. Let me see what else. Okay, what recommendations do you have for retailers? Sucharita, you want to take a stab at that one first?
Sure. Yeah, I think that a lot of the recommendations for retailers are not unlike the recommendations for for brands, and that is also to support brands in their journey toward eControl, and to support brands in their journey toward having more sophisticated marketing measurement. And retailers themselves should have more sophisticated marketing measurement. Part of how we've got into where we have got into with respect to digital marketing is because we have been reliant on last click attribution. And I think it's time as an industry that we step back and realize that it is insufficient to judging what are the best marketing channels and what are effective marketing channels. I remember when I was a marketer in retail more than a decade ago, and back then there were debates around the value of last click attribution, and that is an argument we still have not resolved more than a decade later. It's time, and it's time to start having more sophisticated marketing measurement. It's time to engage in media mix models and kind of make this part of everybody's marketing toolkit. It's not as fast, it's not as cheap as last click attribution, but it needs to be done because as you saw in my slide, the titans are growing and most of you are not, and therein lies the problem.
Okay, there's another question on what metrics should marketers be measuring and leveraging in this digital era or this time. I would just say from a metrics perspective, I mean, I think return ROI or return on ad spend is obviously a metric we always want to understand. I think anything you can do real time to be agile is important. So understanding reach, frequency, and the ROAS is important. Obviously, be smart during this time period, and again, look at your campaign periods and understand what cutoffs make sense and what brands you're looking at make sense. But those are definitely what we're measuring for people. And again, things that you can do more real time to be agile, course correct, and increase your advertising ROI is what we would recommend. Lift is what we talked about a little bit here, where we can measure a campaign and see if it worked or not, or doing something prior to launch to see if it's working on a small scale before you would launch it broadly. But I think anything where you can get to an ROI metric where you're seeing if it moved the needle is a metric that we want to be leveraging in the digital space or in other spaces as well. So another question, how might COVID-19 change people's strategies in the CPG space? Sucharita, do you want to take that first and then I can speak to it?
Yeah, what we're really seeing with respect to COVID is, I think, certainly you're seeing a lot more replenishment of key items, and that's kind of goes without say. I think the big question over time for CPG is what happens to grocery stores. So the two big questions, of course, are how long is all this going to last, and if this was going to last for weeks to months longer, and we start to recognize that maybe even grocers are not well aligned with social distancing, do we force more curbside pickup? Are we forcing people to do more of the online ordering? And when we do that, the question becomes also, how do you prioritize people who are first in line? What do you do to allocate, kind of items appropriately? So those will be, I think, the big questions over the next few weeks for grocery and CPG.
Yeah, I totally agree, with what you said. And I think, again, just understanding at what phase we're at, if we could put these into phases, not knowing how long this is going to last. But I think people had an initial reaction to COVID, and I think now people are settling in and trying to, figure it out and understand how we're going to live in this for however long it is. So there were different, if we're in, I'll say, the quarantine, phase, if you will, and just trying to understand, as you said, how we live in this environment with, grocery, curb pickups and things like that, or more buying online. I don't think as many people are hoarding and things like that now. So I think maybe for some of the products that we saw that with initially, it is leveling out a little bit. So from a measurement and doing things like that, I think we could be in a little bit of a better place, hopefully, now that we're kind of getting more used to, I'll say, a quote, normal quarantined life. But I think we just have to see, again, how long is this going to last? Also, how does it end, right? You know, so I think we just have to think of all of, again, these different phases. And I also think, going back to the demographics, there's different demographic groups who are, again, having different media habits as well as different buying habits. And I think we just have to understand these different groups. There's going to be different strategies for reaching them and measuring them as well. So again, I think this is where we go back to data, and the more data that we have will help us understand these groups and then therefore measure these groups. And I just think this disruption, unlike some of the other disruptions that we've had in the past, where it was, you know, snowstorms or different diseases where maybe they were a shorter time period, this one's going to be a bit of a longer time period, which is going to change the dynamics here for us. And we're just going to have to figure this out a little bit as we go. But I think still having the data, having the information, having the measurement is still important. So we just can figure out how we work in this new normal for this period of time, whatever it is. So I think just kind of like understanding how we work through this together with, you know, companies, with retailers, with consumers, we have to just all kind of figure this out together. And I think what's great about it is everyone's providing a lot of information very regularly so we can educate ourselves, which is, I think, a great thing. Okay, so I think those are most of the questions. A lot of the questions that are coming in are more around, you know, can we get this PowerPoint? Will we be sending this out? Yes, I think as we said at the beginning of the presentation, we will be sending this out after, so everyone will have all the slides.
Thank you so much, Sucharita and Kristin. We are approaching the end of the session, but as a reminder, if we couldn't get to your question, as Kristin said, we'll try to respond to it via email. The email is here at the bottom of the slide, and we can respond to you directly. We will be sending out the recording of this presentation to everyone that attended. With that, I want to give a big thank you to our speakers, both Kristin and Sucharita. You've both been great. Thank you so much to our audience for taking time out of your busy day to join us. We look forward to seeing you all in a future Nielsen webinar. Thank you.